Thinking we should just give it a couple more minutes for people to join. Glad you've chosen our breakout room. Nada, do you think that we're ready to get started? Do you want to kick us off?
Yes, okay. Welcome everyone to this breakout room. It's related to privacy ethics and trust in connected healthcare. And we are Emily and Neda, the facilitators. And Emily, would you like to introduce yourself and then I'll mind?
Okay, sure. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Emily Spratt. I'm a fellow in the Data Science Institute at Columbia University. My background is everything related to images and also strategic advisory. I did my doctorate at Princeton University, and I'm just delighted to be here with you guys today.
Thank you, Emily. This is Neda Philip. I am from Kingston University, London in UK. And I'm associate professor in the area of mobile healthcare. So my specialty is in designing and developing mobile healthcare systems and solving the related challenges to that. And in relation to these workshops, I work with the IEEE working group on the clinical Internet of Things, data and device interoperability with tips, and I look after or I co-chair the privacy subgroup. Yeah.
I should also add that I'm in the same group, in fact.
So shall we start with the points for discussion? Yeah. Would you like to say something, Emily?
Okay, yeah, sure. I'll just sort of say the general question, and then you can expand upon it a little bit further. Mm-hmm. So the first question that we're going to be considering is how we can simply identify and discuss together in the session the challenges and risks for privacy, ethics, and trust in connected healthcare. And immediately, I just want to sort of bring attention to sort of the two areas that I think we need to be cognizant of separating out in our discussion. And that is really sort of where we're talking about applied uses of technology specifically for healthcare versus larger questions about the ethics of technology in general. And so Nada and I, in preparation for this session, we've had long discussions actually about this, particularly in through the example of the uses of artificial intelligence for connected healthcare, and how so much of the discussions about AI for healthcare actually really go to fundamental questions about the ethics of AI in general. And so we want to somehow bring out in the conversation through the examples that some of you will hopefully bring to the table, how it is that we can kind of create a framework which is open enough to consider the big questions that need to be addressed more broadly, but also to really bring things in specifically to their applications. Where are the dividing lines for those things? Where are the bridges? Where is the overlap happening? And how do we basically direct this discussion to be very focused on its application in healthcare? Nada, would you want to explain further what we elaborated on?
Yeah, and you mentioned AI, and you know, Julian explored so many applications and kind of ideas for connected healthcare. So basically, we are looking, as Emily said, for identifying these challenges and risks for privacy, ethics, and trust. And as you know, addressing privacy and ethics requirements, connected health, system design and development is vital to develop trust in using systems at the end. So from your own experience, if you can, you know, maybe discuss with us or identify such risks. Um, yeah.
I'm just going back to some of our discussion, Nada. I think that you had specifically mentioned the issues of local data storage versus cloud storage. We touched upon wearables and sensors. So basically, we want to put the question out there to everyone that's here in this room. What experiences specifically have you had in this space where an issue has come up? And then maybe we can speak then more broadly through the examples that arise in this conversation.
I'm not sure how you participate here, but I'd like to make a point. I'm 80 years old. I'm a senior member of IEEE, but I'm coming here from the point of view of an actual user. I run a pacemaker, which I'm 100% dependent on. And the user, I notice, is not really part of this discussion. And yet trust of the users is going to be a critical element in the take up, particularly as we get two-way communication with wearables, which are growing at an amazing rate. I've been doing some analysis of what this does to qualities and assessments of that type. So I'm simply saying the user perspective is one that understandably isn't part of the medical profession area, but it is absolutely critical to the take-up of extended wearables and, shall we say, more interactive healthcare.
Marcus, that's an excellent point, and I'm so glad that you've been able to articulate it to our group so eloquently. Actually, our next focus question is in fact gaps in this space in sort of developing ethics and trust. And one of the things one of the sort of the directions we were hoping to explore together in this group was actually how issues about user perception of these things needs to be assessed and strategized before we can even build something, because if we're not even aware of what are the concerns about these things from the user perspective, as you point out, we can't even really begin to address this in a competent manner. So that's great. I'm wondering, Nada, should we maybe dive into this a little bit more, or shall we put Marcus's excellent remark sort of on hold and come back to it in point 2 and just sort of maybe seek out more examples here at this point?
I think we should seek some more examples so we can cover point 1, which is identifying risk, and we'll come back to this point when we talk about the gaps.
Thank you again, Marcus.
May I make a second point? I've actually just finished a couple of years on the ethics committee, the professional ethics committee. I refused to join the AI ethics committee of the Australian Computer Society, which they asked me to do, because what I wanted to do is change the focus of the professional ethics from what one might politely put as a defensive mode to an active engagement, i.e. support of whistleblowers and individuals in complex situations. And I got a sufficient shift that I was able to resign, so it didn't become my initiative, it remained theirs. I have published a few points on this. I did an ethics master's not long ago just to sharpen up my understanding of big data and virtue ethics. So I'm merely making these comments to indicate the kind of things that individuals in this discussion might follow with me.
Yeah, also feel free to use the chat if you have a link to some of the publications. That would be great for us to keep track of. And we have a wonderful student here with us from Columbia who's helping us keep track of all of these things, and that will go into the final report. So please just feel free to put that into the chat and we can incorporate that into the document we're compiling as a result of this event.
It's 4 a.m. for me here, and I'm still doing this from bed, and I'm not anywhere near any of our other materials. So my apologies. Please follow up with a communication if you so desire.
Tia, maybe you could make note to follow up on that. Okay, so maybe let's open this up so other people have a chance to chime in as well. We'd love to know your thoughts on what we've laid out so far.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tisha. And a challenge that I was just thinking of, or a risk, is just thinking about how in the healthcare field, there's so much data that has to be shared and communicated in order to continue to advance the field. And so for me, just thinking just about that anonymization of data and de-identifying in the sense that, you know, with so much data coming in, you still aren't able to link that information back to patients. And so just that challenge of, with so much more data, the ability to link that information back to individuals is a super huge issue in my personal opinion. I think that's a real challenge in this area.
Thank you very much for your insights on that. I think that actually speaks to some of the projects that Nada is working on. Nada, would you want to maybe kind of go into some of your expertise in that area?
So you're talking about anonymization of data, and because of big data, and you know, I'm just looking at your question. Because of big data, and it is the difficulty of linking that. I didn't understand your question properly. Can you repeat it, please?
Yes, so I was just stating how with the increase of the type of data that's being collected, there's the ability that what in the past may not have been identifiable may now become identifiable information. And so just how to take that data and in the midst of sharing it, how to make sure that it's not uniquely identifiable for a patient and it stays anonymous.
Yeah, this is an important question, really, and is a challenge currently for big data analytics. No matter how kind of anonymize the data or pseudonymize the data, still we are not sure if based on the data linkability, patient can be identified and so on. So this is kind of one of them. I can see it as one of the risks that you identified really, and a challenge, especially in this area or big data analytics, let's say. So I can look at it as an identified risks and a challenge.
Yeah, just in terms of we've already mentioned maybe building a little bit of a bibliography in this discussion. One book that I am quite interested in is the Ethical Algorithm: The Science of Socially Aware Algorithm Design by Roth and Kearns. Maybe some of you know this book, but I thought that their discussion of the issues around differential privacy are really relevant, especially from the AI angle, which is clearly not the only issue. They're just simply the issues around the data collection of these things, and the ability to have consent about it is fundamental, and that's not related to AI at all. But as these things get exacerbated, it's been interesting, the conversations that have been having around differential privacy, especially from sort of the data science side of things.
And also, like, if we can elaborate on this, I mean, this big data analytics is data related to patients that's been collected for 10 years or more than that. So how do you get the consent of, because at the time when the data collected, they didn't think about one day it will be used for data analytics and so on. So how do you go back and take a consent from these patients, which you cannot follow now? This is another issue. You know, I can see related to this point as well, say they consent. Yeah.
Could I add something?
Oh, so, please do.
Yeah. So in the chat, I shared a poster. It's not. We don't have to go through it, but with some of the colleagues at medical centers in the Netherlands, we tried to look at what is exactly the problem for data sharing and healthcare data, and for especially for research purposes, and where there's this whole idea of open science and open data, and then that conflicts with the privacy issues and so on. So there were so many angles on that topic that and that's something that you described as well, that we tried to to make it visually easy to see the different layers of the discussion. So that's why we came up with these Chinese walls, where at the outside, so in the heart you have the data, and the outside you have the ethical checks, and then so there's different layers of getting through the data for the different purposes, for different roles. So the doctors and the patients even accessing their data and so on. So this is not meant for the discussion, but it is very hard to even for, say, senior management to understand what is exactly the problem that we're tackling. And this is just a way to look at it. I just wanted to contribute to that. The other thing.
Oh, just wait, Taya, will you add that to the document that we're creating with the link to that? That's great. Please continue. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, thank you.
And the other thing I became really aware of in the presentation just now, the keynote, was the levels of vulnerability, of course, in the connected healthcare. And we've been addressing similar things, I think. And what I've been wondering about is what if there are any examples in the medical environment, in the healthcare environment, of implementations of the so-called zero trust architecture, where you address all these levels of vulnerabilities and come up with an architectural framework to address these. I know in some cases, in some industries, this is done, but I was wondering if such an architecture would help, or if the technology drivers in the medical field are very different from these fields where such an architecture would work. I can imagine, but I'm not. So I'm a DPO at the university. So I work together I collaborate with the medical centers, but my lack of understanding of these issues is too big to really understand this. But in most cases, such an implementation could work. Zero trust architecture.
I think this could be a very nice input to one of our questions about identifying, discuss potential mitigation strategies. It could be added there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and just to become a little bit more granular on that point, actually, I would say that, I mean, maybe I would push back a little bit in terms I think that really these sorts of frameworks are working to create a sense of trust and to give a sense of stability and even potential compliance measures, depending on the particular industry that it's related to, where from a risk management perspective, that we need somehow assurances and standardization about how these things are working. So I know that there's, for example, there is one group in Frankfurt which is doing this with AI, the Z method. A professor there is doing that, exactly that. I have personally asked him, though, that some of the premises upon which that architecture is being built to basically create a compliance sort of measure for any application that would use an AI system. I mean, I think that we're trying to build a sense of security about AI in particular, a technology that is very difficult to give assurances about, just given the way that it is developing and the nature of how it actually works. And so while I think that those things are essential, I think we also have to recognize that we have to work within the limitations of what this is, which requires an openness and a flexibility. I think the advantage of our group here being focused on healthcare and the advantage of the IEEE working group that Nada and I are a part of, that Florence runs the TIPS, is to actually sort of highlight where it is that we can at least identify those areas that need to remain open and flexible, and that we need to actively being cognizant of to essentially grow and expand. And this, and Nada and I have had a lot of discussions about this in relation to the mitigation strategies, because you can basically say from a compliance standpoint that, okay, here's this standard that at the point of design, somebody has to follow and check off on a list for just basic compliance kind of concerns. But then with the issues of the way that technology is constantly growing and cybersecurity is not a static threat, but very much one that is ever changing, how do we then mitigate this with then the use, the deployment of hardware and then separately software over time when we can't even necessarily predict what those threats are going to be? And so then the idea of having an ethical framework sort of falls apart, because anything related to standards and measures is a reflection of something that already exists, of a real world phenomenon. And so I think that the key problem here is that you can't have a reflective system making recommendations and checking things off a list in a good risk management kind of way when we don't know what it even is yet. So the question that we wanted to actually pose to the group is, could we even recommend that there be a difference in sort of the ecosystem of hardware and software once it is deployed? Should that actually be subjected to a different sort of ethical compliance system, different than the one at the point of its design? And how would that actually work through the example of connected healthcare? Does that mean that the manufacturer needs to provide continued sort of compliances and measures and standards that have to be upheld to secure something? Or is that then the responsibility of the hospital that is using these products? Where do you basically put then the ownership of that very, very large responsibility? Should also there be, on a larger level, should there be a national or even an international sort of component to this, in the same way that the Securities and Exchange Commission is there to sort of regulate financial markets? Should we be thinking about something like that with tech as it grows and as it exists in the marketplace? So these are questions, and we don't have to solve everything in this workshop, but what we want to, the purpose of what we're doing here today is to sort of start the conversation and to be able to find where we can highlight and underscore the issues that need further address, where there isn't necessarily a clear solution, but that we're going to need to figure out how exactly we're going to design flexibility into these systems. So I would love all of your reflections on that and how we might start to do that together.
Hi, this is Esteban Pino, if I may.
Please.
Yeah.
So I those are very good questions, and I fully agree with you. And I think maybe the framework should be on the ethics side, because if a hospital buys a system and the company that sells it goes bankrupt or whatever, they won't be able to do the maintenance, or so it should be more global. I think, I don't know. But what I wanted to add also is I've been working with a colleague of mine, and one of the possibilities is to have the patient decide on how much information he wants to share. So if he's confident with, I mean, he doesn't feel threatened by sharing a lot of information, then he can set up that level of information. If he wants more privacy, he can set in the same monitoring system. So try to also approach the problem from the what's the patient, how much he wants to share. So and it's a little bit what the first person was saying about thinking from the patient side.
Yeah, thank you so much, Esteban, for that contribution. And I love how that actually just goes right off of Marcus's point earlier, and also what Natisha was saying too. Where then is the where does the perspective of then the patient fit into this whole thing? And I think we're actually ready to go to the discussion point about perception of these things, and what we already started to discuss with Marcus's comment. And that is, how do we gauge the level of trust that currently exists right now with these things? What is the actual ground truth perception about using interconnected health devices versus what actually are the vulnerabilities? And what would be a way to get an accurate measure for that? Would that involve a survey? Who would the participants be? How do we get some clarity as to what actually is going on, what actually is the concern about these things versus us here who are in this room who have a deeper knowledge of what actually is the concern? So, and how do we find alignment there as we move forward with this ethical discussion? So does anyone have any ideas about that? And I'm glad to see that Florence has joined our workout room for a minute here. So if you want to add anything, we would be very grateful for your comments as well.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm bopping around to all the family rooms.
Good.
So on your topic of how do we understand how people look at trust, or how do we enable it, I thought there were some really good comments about ethics and how people look at them differently. It's really important, and even trust, and I find it to be geographic in some ways. The European Union has been very good. I don't know if the citizens taught the EU, or the regulators taught the citizens, but there's a lot of collaboration about the need for privacy and the right to be forgotten, and don't even think about, connecting my data. I remember years ago when cloud stuff was still kind of starting, even though we always had clouds, but we didn't call them that. And I remember Germany came out with a rule that any data that created in Germany had to stay in Germany. Yeah. And I was like, well, what if I have my Fitbit with me? Do I have to leave it there? Like I was thinking about, what does that really mean, if the data is created there? And the data and the device could be connected to a system or software elsewhere. It could be that the device manufacturer is in another country and they have to keep track of the maintenance, so it just started all these questions in my head about what is the right ethical thing to do? Do you just stop and not allow connectivity, and therefore the maintenance could get behind? And if there's a security flaw, you can't update it, so those are the things I worry about with, someone might say, I don't trust that. But then I'm thinking, well, I like to keep you alive, which is what the working group is working on with, clinical IE, trust, identity, privacy, protection, safety, and security. So how do you protect the humans, because they may not be technically savvy. It could be a young child who has a caregiver that doesn't understand the technology. There's so many issues with what trust really means. Do you want to trust that the device is going to keep you alive? Or do you want to trust that you know how the data is being used? Or how do you decide?
Florence, thank you so much for those comments. I think Marcus wanted to say something.
Yes, it's a fairly, it may sound trivial, but it isn't. I have an implant. I'm 100% dependent on it from having a new heart valve. And so I've been doing investigations as to what environments I can safely go. You would be staggered to find how hard it is to find this out. It is amazingly difficult. Even buying the standards are very expensive. You ask occupational health and safety people for what magnetic field surveys they've done, and they sort of go blank. Yet it's a matter of life and death to me anywhere near a welding gear, which indeed I was doing a welding course. Now, that particular area is one that has been left absolutely fallow in these discussions, because medical people talk about areas where there's a prior level of knowledge and understanding and the ability to ask productive questions. The missing link is getting people to be able to ask productive questions. The awful lesson in Australia was of a shocking exercise in integrated health data, which was basically clearly designed to commercialize the data. And it was a complete disaster and destroyed an awful lot of trust. And 40% of people refused to even join the system or allow their data to go to it. If we do not address those issues, in other words, raise the standard of understanding of those who are subject to it, we're not going to get sense. And why do I say this? Because it only requires one or two bad examples to propagate at an enormous rate. So when we're talking about trust, we also have to build the basis for the understanding to allow trust to emerge. And I think that area, there's another initiative in IEEE called DETA, which Greg Adamson runs. I look after governance and identity in that area. But it's become more and more obvious to me that the discussions in AI, and I used to publish in AI in the 1980s, have not got an understanding of what it is. People confuse machine learning with AI, and it's not the sole area. And so they assume things. There is not the basis for a good discussion. So I've just covered two things. One is, how do you get trust at the end user level? The second one is, what is the level of knowledge to do? And some of the knowledge can actually rebound rather badly when you integrate the data. And thirdly, you have concentrated on the hospital environment, but not in the explosively growing normal environment where medical implanted devices and wearables are now being run. I don't even know where I can go wearing 100% dependence on an implant. I'm having to do a lot of research to find out. People don't even know what the standards are. They don't do those surveys, even to the magnetic levels. Now, I know this is a long disquisition, but I thought that a little balance from somebody in the user space as well as with technical knowledge might be helpful.
That was very valuable. If I could add to that, Marcus, I was going to DEF CON, a year or two, well, when we were still traveling, a year and a half ago. And I was sitting next to a guy that had an implant, a pacemaker. Actually, it was a Medtronic device. And he was going to DEF CON. And I said, can you disconnect that thing? Because people are hacking all over the place there. You're not even supposed to carry around your credit cards, right? So, I actually contacted a friend at Medtronic to say, what can we do? This is the device number, serial number. He gave it to me. And it was, I think he wasn't able to turn off the telemetry. I think he either had to have some other person do it, or he could have gone to his provider beforehand. But here we were on the tarmac already in the plane. So I just told him to be careful if he's going into the biohacking village, because people go there to hack devices. And as you probably know, I have a friend who, 5 years ago, he would say, gosh, I'm on a plane and I can see every Raspberry Pi on the plane, or at least 5 rows in front of me and 5 rows behind me. So a lot of this stuff is discoverable. So I totally agree with you that there's a lot of risk. And not only do you not know where the risk is, but the question is, what do you do about it?
Well, information is always a major contributor, information and education. But the problem is, unless you engage, and in fact, this currently affects the older people more than the younger ones because of the rate of increase in implants and monitoring. And the stereotyping of the elderly is so terrifyingly strong. I mean, when I start have a discussion, people discover I'm 80 in 3 months. They say, oh, you're much younger than I said. For Christ's sake, I'm no different than most of my friends. And we have no agency in the system. So step one, provide elders and patients with agency. It's a very simple point. But you look at any aged care system, how many of them have agency? Now, if you want to have trust, you need to provide agency.
And when you say agency, do you mean at like a governance level, or actually being able to update your device, and turn it off if you're going into an unsafe area?
Agency means being treated as a person.
Okay.
And let me assure you, when you get a bit older, you'll discover the elders are not treated as persons.
Yeah, you know, I'll
I'm
tell
afraid
you.
that's a little savage, but believe me, I encounter it.
No, I understand. You know, interestingly, you know, my daughter has a friend in his 20s who had a major heart attack. And they didn't, because he's so young and thin and fit, they didn't assume he was having, they were like, gosh, we don't know what's wrong with him. He just passed out. And they finally started doing all these tests. It took them a while to figure it out. Now, an elderly patient, they probably would have gone right there. But for him, they didn't. And it's been a long journey. He almost lost his legs, a lot of stuff, but, you know, saphenous vein sites and stuff. But it happens at every age, I think, Marcus, and it's just different, you know. But you're right, for the elderly, it's very difficult.
Let me assure you that that is a simplification. Agency, namely treated as a person, once you get to the 70s and 80s, in many environments, you are not. You are treated as a research object,
Oh my goodness.
at best. And I'm reporting now, I didn't think I'd have to say this in a meeting like this, as someone who has suffered this in a number of domains. So if you want trust, start to treat many of the people concerned as people. Consider that they're not stupid idiots. Some of them may have better experience than you, but they're just a little older. But this particular cultural aspect is one that I'm picking up from your earlier comment. Asians have a different attitude. So it is more a Western problem. And I just want to leave it at that, because we're doing medicine to help people, but people are not part of these discussions. Yet the moment we have the massive telemetric and real-time data flows and dependence on devices, people are not just another instrumented device. They are the purpose of the object. And we have not done our homework on it. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Marcus. We really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, Marcus, that's great. Thank you so much. Your comments make me think actually of the research group that I lead at Duke University in their ethical tech program. And I'm working with a wonderful group of students from all over the world. And the students from Asia, their attitude about our project, which is focusing on the company Clearview AI and the issues with facial recognition technology there, their attitude has largely been like, well, we trust our government to keep us safe, and we believe as citizens, for the most part, that this is all to our benefit. So we don't have the concerns that you're raising here in the United States about this, or in the context of Europe. So I just value so much you emphasizing the cultural component of it. It's actually something that Nada and I discussed at length, how important that is to consider as we think more globally about the perceptions around trust. That's going to be different on an individual basis. It's going to differ across cultures. It's going to differ depending on what age you are, what experiences you've had. And we need to find a way to be cognizant of that. But also, I think that we need to get some quantifiable measures about these things so that we can use that information to guide how it is that we're steering through this.
And
I'm happy to collaborate if you so desire.
That would be great. Thank you. I have to bop to another room. I have to see all of them. I'm sorry, Emily, but great job to everyone.
Thanks for stopping by, Florence.
Thank you.
Thank you, Florence.
Nada, it looked like you were going to say something. Please, all you.
No, it's okay. I just was thanking Florence. I mean, you mentioned this topic of the cross-border, I think, yeah, how to create an international standard that satisfies local regulation. How do we address the ethics and privacy worldwide and cross-border? Because we have different culture, as you mentioned. So maybe do we need like to have some sort of unified standards so we can. So if we take the device anywhere in the world, will be satisfying their, let's say, privacy and ethics and so on. Yeah.
Just as I'm looking at the time, and I believe that we have about 5 more minutes before we're going to go back to the main room. And I just want to be sure that the folks here that are together that haven't gotten a chance to speak, would you like to add anything? We'd love to hear your perspectives.
Hi, I'm Deepthi and I'm from India, and I'm a doctoral student and I do work on consent management framework, which is central to basically the health information when you take what is the importance of letting the patient know exactly about the consent that we are taking, means explaining to them the details of what they are consenting to, and how the data is going to be used, and looking at the limiting the data that we collect about a patient, whether it is really required for that particular use that we are looking at. So I'm not sure if it is going to be relevant to this context, but we are mainly looking at making it easy for the patients to understand what they're consenting to.
Thank you very much for your insights. Do you, by any chance, have any links or suggested readings about what it is specifically that you're doing that we could add to our notes for this this breakout group?
Yeah, sure. I can just give you some links to the consent management frameworks that we are looking. We have something which we're trying to develop, which I'll give you the link to. And we're having a process framework that we're trying to build also. Definitely, I'll give you a link to that.
Thank you so much for sharing. That wonderful. Also, I just see that we have Nina on the call too. Would you like to add anything for the conversation? Okay, I know that everyone is checking in here from different time zones, so thank you for being with us. We realize that this is very much an international call. Marlon, I want to go back. You've been adding some really insightful comments into the chat. For those of you who are not a multitasker, I'm not a multitasker. I haven't gotten a chance to read all of them, but do you want to maybe sort of just sort of hit on some of the key points that you have added here?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's many aspects of the issues that we it's a big problem, and I think the complexity is already there when you just look at sensor data from the sensors, and how to get them, how to communicate those data safely remotely, as we saw in the keynote talk. And I think with respect to perhaps international standards and so on, so I'm thinking along the lines of the GDPR. That is the thing that is my framework, right? So I would simply expect that the sensor data collects all the data necessary for the specific purpose and nothing more, and that the transport of the data is secured in a way. And the in a way is of course very interesting. So, and there's these levels of vulnerability, and they were already mentioned. And I think that is a separate cluster of issues and good context to think about, aside from the even more complex aspect of adding machine learning to the processing of this data, and what it means for, and what that means for patients, and how they can be a victim of bias and all these things. But I think even on the mere data aspects, and sometimes the lack of standardization of certain values in the data, and to compare it with other systems or other sensor data from other products, other service providers, I think that is already a very big problem, even for trust, because you need to have of course, you base your decisions and your diagnosis on certain data and certain assumptions, as you say, but that is, let's say, that's human based or knowledge based, and not machine learning, but so that is a level on itself. So the standardization of the data, the way they censor data, the way they send it, and one last remark, what you sometimes see is that not only the data that is relevant for the specific purpose is collected, but for others, for administrative purposes, timestamps, and all, more data is collected, and sometimes that is going to be a problem if the protection of the data is not really secured. Aside from the hacking and really getting control of the machine and doing stuff that is really bad. So I think there's many levels that you could separately analyze.
Yeah, this sort of the last points that you were making there reminds me of what Nada and I were discussing in some detail. Actually, then our role here is thinking about standards frameworks, and then how do you basically create a model where you're being respectful of the local place, the individual, and then the locale, but then also working within an international standards framework where everybody's objectives are met. That's very hard to do. Yet there's certainly an incentive to have a standardization so that if somebody does move from one country to another, that they can have assurances that their sort of data health around them, in a sense, can also be used appropriately. But how do we really actually build that when there are such different attitudes about these things, and there are so many different policies governing how this is collected, how it's used, how then how these things are working in concert together? It's not just in the one particular, it's not just related to then the guidelines in Europe, which might be then safer in terms of the privacy rights of a citizen, but how do we get that working in concert with other players too? And should we automatically then default to sort of the most conservative ideas about data shareability? Is that in itself is an ethical problem? Is how to, by choosing the standard, there's a sort of favoritism in that, and how do we also then leave open a space for innovation? Because the more conservative we are about these things, then the less space there is for us to explore. I loved the comment that Julian made in the keynote, that really it was because of a lack of regulation with the emergency response for COVID, that, all right, we can suddenly manufacturers are saying it's okay to allow novel ways of connecting devices here, and that it doesn't have to go through basically security and compliance around that as it would have. That restriction was removed, recognizing that the crisis needed solving right now. And that allows us to then study that phenomenon, get data about how it is that we're approaching that, and explore and have the freedom to explore. So how do we also keep that space for innovation open while protecting the individual, protecting privacy, and also recognizing that there is a need to sort of, hold back on these things? That's, I think, the fundamental dialectic here is, respecting the conservative desire to have standards that don't share anything on the one extreme versus a fully open one where basically the market rules and it's innovation. So where do we find compromises there? Where is it appropriate to do that? Who are the people that can say where those compromises can be made? And should there be an international committee that decides these things, that has representatives of all voices? How do we do this? I mean, this is sort of this workshop is really about just thinking about the larger questions that we need to be going through. And there will be later on another workshop specifically on ethics, but this, what we've been trying to do here today is really just pick up on individual, perceptions about these issues, and to make notes on them, and to have an idea for how we will structure the workshops moving forward. So I'm going to turn it back to Nada in terms of, I think we're starting to wrap up now before we move back to the main session, if I've got the timing right here. Oh, I think Nada, I think you're still on mute, actually. I hate it when that happens. I always do that myself.
Thank you very much for all the inputs. I have collected some information regarding the risk mitigation, the gaps, and even the recommendation kind of points that we can put them in the different perspectives, these points that we collected. So we can summarize this outcome later on in the main meeting of this.
I just also am noticing here that Judy, you joined our group a little bit later. Would you like to introduce yourself or add anything to our discussion since you weren't with us in the first part of our discussion?
Yeah, my apologies for joining late. I had an unavoidable conflict, and I'm sorry I missed out on the bulk of the discussion.
No problem at all. We're glad you're here. And actually, the recording will be made available. So as long as everyone who's signed up officially, you should get an email back. Taya, that's right. You might know that detail more than I do since you're doing the logistics. But there should be a recording that then everybody gets with this.
Great. Yes. So I'm Judy Barkel. I'm part of Health 2047 Inc. We are a subsidiary of the American Medical Association. We're focused on helping to nurture new ventures in healthcare. Our name is derived from we recognize it's a long journey to transform healthcare, and the year 2047 happens to be the 200th anniversary of the American Medical Association. They had a change in leadership a little less than a decade ago, and he has been very focused on trying to do transformational things, and the AMA has a very strong stance on patient privacy, data privacy. They've put out a number of policies, and that is one of the strengths of the American Medical Association is their ability to convene and drive policy forward as I'll call us the commercial arm, trying to help entrepreneurs, some of whom don't understand all of healthcare. Some understand healthcare, but maybe not technology as much. We serve as a bridge and help nurture them, nurture their ideas, get them to a startup level, do some seed funding, and help get them on their way, hopefully to grow bigger and better. We have a number of innovation hubs of hospital systems and payers and other networks that bring a test bed together, if you will, to look at solutions. And we work actively trying to find not just point solutions, but comprehensive types of solutions.
Judy, can I just interject and ask a question here? From the entrepreneurship side, do you find in your experience so far that that investors are then looking to ask then the ethical questions that sort of we're focused on in this group? Do you see that being of interest? And how are those in that space? How are those questions being formulated, and why? I mean, I'm wondering if there is within business, if there is a concern about future potential regulations, and how does that then affect, especially early stage companies, how they're getting funding, given the fact that, I mean, the biggest issue here is that all of these issues with trust and ethics of technology, it's a moving target. I mean, one of the key problems in the United States anyway, is that we haven't really fully developed our policies around that. And my experience in entrepreneurship is that sometimes there are hesitations to give a very promising, from just a research perspective, early stage company seed investment, because it's an unknown factor what then the regulatory climate will be around it. So what have you seen there?
Yeah, there's definitely I'll call it angst in the entrepreneurial community about where things are heading. And it's everything from software as a medical device. FDA puts out guidance. They have an AI/ML action plan, but many entrepreneurs have not maybe been through all the phases that would be impacted by these changing regulatory requirements. It's actually one of the biggest areas that we nurture new ventures in, is how to start from the get-go in getting patient consent to use their data, etc. So I'm sorry, I can't answer all of your questions. It looks like there's a timeout.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Judy. I think they're going to, we need to leave the breakout room now in 2 seconds. So,
thank you everyone for all of your comments and your input. All so insightful and much appreciated. And we'll put those in the notes and definitely give it all of what you've.
Awesome. So for everybody to load. Okay, I think we have quite a few people here. Okay, so I hope you all enjoyed the breakout. It gave you some time to get into what I like to call very hands-on, very interactive. And now we're going to ask each of the groups. I don't know if you empowered your facilitator to be the one to report back, or you guys nominated someone in your group to share, but we're going to ask each of the groups to give about a 10-minute roundup of basically the 4 core points that we asked you guys to address, and basically share with everyone how it went and what you talked about, the recommendations, mitigation strategies, risks, wherever you focused on from the point of view. Just to share with everybody, you know, as Florence mentioned, we had our student facilitators in each of the rooms, and they took great notes, and our goal is to share hopefully within the next week or 2, the actual summary of all the sessions. We're going to share with all of you and also other registrants who may be coming on board to view this on demand. So definitely you will all have access to both verbal and some written form of what went on in each of these breakouts. So with that, I would like to have the nominated individual to talk about what happened in security and interoperability and connected healthcare session. We're going to call it session 1 for now.
Parthiv and Mode, are you ready? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do you need time to regroup, or are you ready? I think you're on mute mode. You're on, yeah, I said that in the right order.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, so we had a very lively discussion. We're just very energetic, so we didn't pay much time. We could not finish all the way. But it's pretty good discussion, and I nominate Parthiv to start. Go ahead, Parthiv.
I think you're on mute, Parthiv. Might be double muted. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So, I would like to thank all the participants and Dr. Goldman and Florence for being there and adding to the discussion we had. In terms of we did touch base upon the security threats and vulnerabilities that we have today. We talked about the future, you know, and what keeps you up at night. And it was a pretty varied discussion. One thing I was sure, and again, I'm just, my thoughts, I'm speaking out here, and you'll get more details when we put our things in writing, is I think we have a long way to go. I think from my perspective, we haven't thought about these areas, given enough thought, and it's still work in progress from at least that perspective. And I do think that we would need to put in a lot more effort to get where we need to be, from what controls are being used, what we need to do for the current environment, and also start building to the future environment, because we talked about devices, trusted devices, and how that should be brought into effect. And also going forward is from devices, identities. You know, it's not just human beings, it's not just processes. Devices will play an important role in the future. And then how do we bring that to the forefront? We talked about FDA and UDI, Dr. Goldman did. And again, I think we need to start bringing in all these factors in and really creating a framework that addresses also what should a device be when it's all dressed up, and what exactly information should be provided, and that standard should be there. Because today it's difficult, we realize, to even know what exists on our network, devices, wise, and we are doing reverse engineering, as I mentioned in the conversation with Dr. Goldman, is we are building things back up. We instead the device is telling you who the device is, what do they do, what exactly standards they're following. We don't have any of that today, so that's where we are. And I think we have a long way to go. The last thing I want to say is, from a device management, the device perspective, and incidents happens all the time, breaches happen, but we don't look at devices separately. We think the same incident response plan and program applies to it, which needs to be reconsidered in some ways. And do we come down to a break the glass procedure for devices, because we are dealing with human beings, with lives at stake, and health at stake. So I think these areas we need to reconsider and evaluate, but that's where we're at right now. So hopefully that helps.
Hey, thank you so much, Parthiv and Mohd, for sharing that interesting point of view. I'm sure you guys had some great conversation, and I look forward to see, and we all look forward to seeing the notes. So next up, group 2, privacy, ethics, and trust in connected healthcare. Emily or Nada, will you be sharing some of the activities and discussions in your group?
Emily, would you like to start, and I will follow if you missed it? Is she there?
I think she's muted.
Emily, are you able to unmute?
Oh, I'm so terribly sorry. Yes.
No worries.
Yes, I'll start, say a few remarks, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Nada. We had a wonderful discussion. It started off with a discussion about the distinction between the ethics surrounding issues in technology in general versus a more specific focus on applied technology issues for healthcare. And we are trying to figure out how to basically create a framework which allows for an openness to consider the discussions that are very ripe and burgeoning within the ethics of technology discourse, but ones that also then are specifically developed for healthcare solutions. And while we did have a discussion regarding specific frameworks that are currently being employed for more general applications of AI, for instance, we were brainstorming as to how we could develop very specific measures and standards for healthcare, as was already commented in by workshop 1. So one of the ways we would like to propose doing this to start to build this is by focusing on issues of perception that currently exist regarding where the problems in ethics and trust currently lie versus where they actually are from the practitioners' perspectives and more knowledgeable people within the field. And we discussed the possibility of having surveys about these things, surveys which might include consideration of the cultural differences in this space, as there are major differences in Europe versus the United States versus Asia, just for instance, and how we basically then can gauge those opinions, but not just culturally, but also individually. And one of the points that kept on recurring in our conversations was the role of the individual and the patient, and that when talking about ethics, we're especially all of us here who are on this call are going to be coming at this from the perspective of an expert in the field. But where is the patient in all of this? And how do we create frameworks that is putting the patient first? So again, we think that has to, the first thing we really need to do there is get some quantifiable information as to where the current state of actual concerns with the technology is versus perceptions over issues related to trust, and to do that with an international framework in mind. We also discussed the problem in having ethical frameworks at the point of a product's development, that might be a very different type of ethical framework than once it is actually deployed and is in the wild, as we say in data science. Should there, some of the policy concerns that might be there related to compliance of hardware, of pre-existing hardwares and compatibilities with software, we have to basically work to create a framework that has an openness and flexibility to it to anticipate things that might happen, but also things that there's no way of us actually possibly knowing. And so the problem with any sort of ethical framework is that it implies a reflection on something that already exists in the world. And so knowing that that's our vulnerability, once something is deployed and out there in the world, how do we create an openness for the fact that issues such as cybersecurity is a moving target? This is not static. Should we be looking to financial management and corporations as a way to think about risk management strategies? Should there be a Securities and Exchange type of commission like there is in finance, but for the healthcare world? Should there be regulatory bodies that then are operating differently from the manufacturers, the hospitals, the patients, and so on and so forth? How do we do that? Where do we place the responsibility? These are open-ended questions. We did not have specific answers for them, but we wanted to have a discussion as to where the responsibility lies about these things. And in terms of the mitigation strategies, we really just identified that there's major differences in the point of design of a new product, hardware versus software, and then again, the deployment of these things over time. And that the idea of having one framework for all of that might not be the final solution, and that we remain open to looking at models from other industries of applied technologies to consider, as this is a very complex ecosystem and sort of large chain where one particular framework might not be serving everything, given the nature of needing flexibility in this growing space. So Nada, would you like to add on to that?
I think you covered everything. I just want to highlight a couple of points. It's included in your summary as well, but somebody talked about big data analytics and data anonymization there, and how do we make sure that data linkability cannot identify patients, and the aspect of consent if you have big data collected over years, 10 years, and you are using the data. Currently, at the time when you collected it, you didn't take the consent of the patient that you will be using it for analysis. How do we deal with that? And also there was the issue of data sharing and also the open source data, and how do we protect data in that case? And if you say we will use anonymization, what about aspect? Because I saw this is one of the messages or one of the kind of note in the chat area. They say, what about genomics data? If you keep it in the open source, it can identify relatives and so on. So yeah, these are my extra points. I think you covered it already.
Nada, your comments just remind me of one last one last conclusion we had, which was actually recognition of the need for allowing the space for innovation to also happen. And the more restrictions that we have in these frameworks, that potentially could limit innovation. So we just want to be aware of that as a factor. How do we build a framework which is conservative in the sense of protecting privacy and vulnerabilities, but also to leave things open enough that we can continue to build these things and have new solutions to problems? And I love the example from the keynote of that even something as horrific as COVID, that we can look at some of the silver linings, that there were some opportunities to explore innovation when regulation backs off a little bit. So how do we sort of find that sweet spot of compromise between the two?
Final thing, I think it's already, I think you mentioned it already. I think it's about moving decision to the patient to decide how much information they want to share and when and so on, to get the control of that. So again, this is part of the mitigation strategy we discussed.
Okay, great. It sounds like very exciting. I often hear many conversations, obviously, about patient data agency in the healthcare sector, something we constantly talk about with volunteers in the healthcare life science practice. So good to see that that still continues to be top of mind for everyone. So our next group 3 is technology and policy consideration in connected healthcare. So either Shane or Farrell, hopefully I said your name right. I don't know who's been nominated to present on the outcomes of that session.
I'll start and then pass it on to Shane to provide some of the information about the recommendations that were identified in the group. We spent time discussing the infrastructure that's required for healthcare systems and for providing the secure connectivity. The house analogy was used in that you have devices that are inside the house and private versus those that are public. A lot of time was spent focused on data. The flow and liquidity of interoperability is weighted, where the term data equity was used. We want data to be volumetric and don't want other data to get in the way as you're processing that data. So that less relevant data can be taken out so that the most important data is available for decision making. Using predictive analytics where you have an instance that's presented, and then with predictive analytics you can identify some best experience in an advisement specific to that experience, that particular situation. So timeliness of data is very important, the real-time access to data, and being able to balance between the seamless user experience and user friendliness with data safety. Communication was another area where we focused in on having a guaranteed minimum bandwidth for real-time healthcare service, encrypted as well as secure. And then IoT devices, having some kind of a concentrator for various devices. One of the issues is the issue of interoperability between all of these different devices that are between hospitals for tracking. Even devices that are within a room may not necessarily be interoperate with one another. Voice-enabled devices, communication platforms to provide timely communication between clinicians, allowing audio archival and proxy calling to better monitor high data equity exchanges. A question that came up is, you know, how can we identify that devices are from reputable players? Can technology optimize the human capacity to perform? Interoperability and standards kept coming up. If you have the same supplier of devices, it's a little bit easier to provide that interoperability. But then what happens when you have various vendors and suppliers and providing for standards, as well as the challenge of enforcing the policies that have been set. Identification, authentication, as well as standardization of devices for IoT devices was discussed as well. And Shane is going to provide some of the recommendations.
Yeah, as for the solutions, we had an extensive discussion as well. So I think the first and the priority would be the standard. So we need to have the vendors, and not only the device vendors, but also the software, even the telecommunication provider can sit down together and to know, first define what would be the technology need. And we need to understand what will be the interfacing. Then we need to have the standard to coordinate each other and all the software device level, even the communication level, so we can provide the comprehensive technical plan to have every single person speak the same technical language. Of course, the interoperability will not only focus on the technology itself, infrastructure should be considered as well. As we mentioned that in the beginning, the infrastructure could be the key challenge. And the infrastructure, not only just like a server communication, but if you look at the current Texas disaster, electricity, heat, water, those could be the important aspects. Well, you don't want to have the remote surgery being interrupted by like losing heat, electricity, something like this. So that also move on to another perspective in the policy. So when we have a policy to enforce this kind of standard or try to have a players sit down together to have the same agreeable technical spec. So should the government step in or not? Or the government can help to have players define the terms of agreement or technical specs accordingly. Yeah. And that's an important part, although it's not very successful in the past 10 or 20 years, but within that could be an important aspect as well. And not only just within a single country, but when you have across the country connected healthcare providing, for example, in Julian's keynote, he mentioned an Ebola case. The patient could be in Africa, but the healthcare provider could be in Europe, doing like a remote telemedicine. So in this kind of across country connected health providing, we may need to have more players, not only just commercial vendors, but also the government to help to facilitate this technology. The third one is regarding the use cases. I think every single use case is different. For example, in the telemedicine, we also have many different types. could be the remote surgery, could be just a consultant. And for the data access, we can have a public cloud or private cloud. So every single use case is different. So we need to be precise about what kind of areas we want to focus on, and then we want to have a full stack integration, because some areas not really so critical, but some areas will have much more requirements. Yeah, so I think these are like 3 major points for our solution and recommendation. I'll stop here.
That was excellent. You're all excellent. I'm so inspired by all of you. Julian was asking a question, a clarifying question in the chat regarding the concentrator. Is it an integration platform or other intent? You know, because I think of, we have routers at home. There are some, you know, device manufacturers where there's a bedside device, you know, where your implanted device connects to that and then phones home. So as you talk about the concentrator and that idea, what was the intent of that?
Yeah, based on my notes, it was from to have a hub where all of that connects the data from the IoT devices. But if others can jump in, that would be great for both for between hospitals, for tracking data, as well as for getting information from just devices in one room.
This is David from one of the other groups. There are some cloud services that will intake data from different manufacturers and put them into dashboards. And Julian probably knows some of these.
Yeah, I think, you know, I heard the word concentrator, and it stimulated the question, because we have to think, kind of drill down a little bit. You know, there's the kind of cloud-based solutions that are data aggregators or concentrators and do a lot of very useful things. But you know, let's talk about some of the use cases we talked about this morning. If you're going to adjust a ventilator in a patient's room, would you use that data and then control the device for that purpose? You know, is it reliable enough? Is it timely enough? Is it fast enough? And would you use that data pathway to display the data from a device? On the other hand, that type of data concentrator that's cloud-based would be perfectly adequate for so many other clinical applications. For example, making recommendations to a patient based upon information from a glucometer and a host of other things. So I think, you know, that's why I think I tend to think of it more as when there's some real timeness and data trust and communication, again, more real time, that especially in high acuity environments, we tend to think more platform based. And then as we think more about cloud data concentrators, it tends to imply another set of use cases. And in 20 years, there may be no difference whatsoever.
Actually, related to that, something that came up in the discussion that I did not cover was just the transference latency. So if you're a user on one end, you may have a certain view with regard to the user interface that's available to you, but then when the data gets transferred, the person on the other end may not have all of the same technology to be able to have the same view.
Yeah, Farrell, there's an interesting, there's research that we're doing right now in our lab on kind of real-time systems for autonomous care. And we've been scratching our heads over the implications of, let's say you have a connected system, maybe it's a platform-based system, you have multiple sensors, and you have multiple, perhaps either closed-loop control algorithms or decision support algorithms or alarm algorithms. How do we ensure that they have the same, they're operating on the same data sets? Because if they don't, you know, good luck ever troubleshooting a system like that, or tracking how you ended up with you know, recommendations. And so we've been looking at different technologies, you know, that have been designed very much for that purpose, like, you know, used in robotic operating systems, for example, for that reason, and others which are simpler and easier and just kind of push data around for other purposes. But you're touching on this vital piece of, as we become, move to more advanced capabilities, and even, I hate to use the words over and over again, let's say machine learning, because it's too easy, but you have to ensure you're using the same data set. It's one thing if it's a static data set that you're pulling from, but if it's a dynamic or real-time data set, it might be different data if you don't have a way to ensure. In an autonomous vehicle, you darn well better be sure you're using it. So
and metric or English units. Hey, that crashed the Mars lander.
Cooking.
Mars
right.
orbiter.
It's ruined a lot of recipes too.
Very interesting. So one more thing I'd like to ask is, we've been hearing data acuity from Faru and from Julian. Can someone just explain that for listeners who may be listening to this afterward, who may think it's data equity, but it's really acuity, and what it means?
How it was explained during our session was that data has weights. So the most relevant, so we want to have access to a lot of data. However, we want to make sure we have access to the most relevant data. And so how do you make that most relevant data available in real time at a moment where a decision needs to be made, and be able to have access to that, the level of data that you need. So someone else might be able to explain it more, but that's what I got out of our discussion.
I think that's good. I was referring to something else, not data acuity, but high acuity clinical use cases. That's what I meant by acuity. But I think, not to undermine, or that was a great point, and I liked it, and then I want to hear more. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, Nada, but I was referring to patient kind of high acuity, such as closed loop control of, say, a blood pressure medication versus making adjustments to someone's insulin regimen at home, where you have a different time scale and so forth, and maybe a human in the loop. Sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to add into that. This is for the real-time system, autonomous care. So kind of you are dealing with a lot of data in real time. How do you make sure that you have time to clean the data before doing any work on it? Kind of remove any empty data or out of range and so on. It's a very, before you apply any algorithm or use it for algorithm.
Is that a question for me? Should I take that?
Yes. Sorry, Florence.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah, because you're a real practitioner from all these different angles, Julie, and so your opinion is very valued.
I have to tell you that you just, asked me a question that's actually the most near and dear to my heart than most of the other topics. In fact, I started working on real-time physiological signal analysis using neural networks and fuzzy logic in the mid-1990s, and built real-time systems and rolled them around on computers in the OR and ICU, and they diagnosed patient problems in real time. Also used them for cardiopulmonary bypass, for clinical decision support using fuzzy logic. And that's exactly what I used to work on, was single signal, and I call it single signal analysis. Is this signal reasonable, or is it garbage? Is it representative of a patient's physiology, or does it have characteristics that are very clearly understood that are foreseeably wrong? Like if a patient has an invasive arterial blood pressure line, there are some things they're out of range numbers, so it's wrong. There could be a square wave. A square wave is caused by flushing the line to clear it. It's not physiological. It could have highly dampened response, which is also typical of a kinked or an air bubble. So there's a lot you can do, and that's true with ECG. With pretty much most waveforms, there are these foreseeable alterations, including just out of range, but it's much more than that. They're morphological characteristics. And in doing those single signal analyses, again, the value of a platform-based approach is you can acquire signals at high fidelity. You can analyze those signals in a kind of a pre-processing approach, or there's a million different ways, right? Whatever makes sense, whatever technology and approach. And then you could decide whether you feed those signals into the larger system. Otherwise, you're feeding in garbage. And you can't, there may be subtle issues, but there are many things that the devices themselves can determine are problems. The gain settings are at maximum, or the patient, their physiological characteristics or morphological characteristics. And that's where I started my work on for neural networks, fuzzy logic, was to address that problem. And I actually shifted my work, my research pathway, because it didn't matter. I had working systems years ago, but without interoperability, without the means to connect and do anything else, it was a waste of time. There was no way to deploy those algorithms on other platforms. So you just kind of triggered the real history of how I got into this. In the 90s, these things were working and they worked just fine, and they diagnosed problems, but there was no way to deploy and adopt. So I took a different pathway to try to help.
Can I add to that? In cybersecurity, when you talk about data quality, you jump into a huge area. And in cybersecurity, we talk about not just confidentiality, but integrity and availability. Well, data integrity is a part of it. And I always think of it in terms of, are we collecting the right data and are we collecting it right? I used to do environmental sampling and environmental lab work. And you're measuring at the part per billion range, and you really got to know whether you're getting the right information because you're making big decisions on it.
So David, if I can, I'll comment that I just spent the last 3 days working on analyzing and working on a paper and some other stuff around autonomous systems. And the first step in this at the simplest level is trying to explain that we're shifting from a world with a human in the loop who is a clinician, nurse, could be a medical assistant. What do you do? You go, you get your blood pressure taken, or your temperature, or your pulse oximetry value, and they put the cuff on, they take it, and they go, oh, that's wrong, I'll take it again. Oh, step on the scale. Oh, that's impossible. I'll take it again. Right? That's what they do. They throw out the bad data. They are the filters at the front end. They're the first step. Yeah. That happens everywhere, in the ICU, in the OR. And so that idea of being the right data, use whatever word I don't want to be too specific, but data that represents the physical state or the physiological state. If you're operating on something else, you're screwed. And so I think, you just nailed it, David. And it's funny that you mentioned it. This has been my, couple of late nights this week dealing and trying to explain to people why this is such, it's the fundamental, it's the base of the pyramid. And you could, just to continue, you could argue, and people will, oh, that all comes out in the wash. That's what big data is for. And, that's what, gazillion mega schmegabytes are for. But it all disappears, right? That's how you can predict flu in the population, and you can do all that. But, it's like applying the quadratic equation and coming up with two answers, one a positive and one a negative value, and saying, oh, yeah, one of these could be the patient's blood pressure. No, actually, they can't both be the patient's blood pressure. Right? One of them is physically impossible. So if we ignore the physical realities or physiological and disease and pathophysiology and instrumentation and its technology, we're kind of like going to go down all these dead ends, hoping to get the right answer instead of basing it on sound principles, which is what I think you just pointed out, David. So
and we come right back to trust. Do you believe what you're reading?
Right. Absolutely.
Right. Excellent discussion. So I'd like.
That's quite interesting. Sorry, just that exploratory data analysis is essential, and that's what I can connect that to what Julian's sentiment is and human in the loop. I mean, I'm so excited to hear that from you, Julian.
And I'll just add last one thing is baseline, right? You need to know what the real truth is before you jump into anything else. So.
Right. Identify patterns, identify anomalies. And as we used to say in software, respect the problem. Don't try to overlook it, right?
Absolutely, Florence.
Absolutely. On that note,
we say ground truth. What is the ground truth?
You don't always know the truth. Sometimes you just know that something isn't true, and you have to accept that.
Yeah,
you do, and figure it out. Agreed. On that note, we'd like to go now to our fourth breakout that Mitch and David facilitated on software and hardware supply chain security and proactive risk management, which has been a very real challenge in the past few months, if not before. So would you like to do a little readout?
Absolutely. And I can handle the first part, David. And so we had a good talk about the challenges and risks. And some of the challenges that we talked about very specifically in medical devices, the need to have long-term device component software supports. So again, Julian, to your note, I remember hearing Dr. Halamka talk about this 6 years ago now at a conference in Boston, and he called out a specific vendor for their ancient operating systems. And we talked a lot about one of the other challenges being the procurement phase and screening. And the example we talked about was the new MDS2 form, which is now a NEMA standard. And how so far, the example I gave my organization, I have seen this form from 2 vendors. Here's the challenge. I have 1,300. And next, we talked a lot about the long-term operating environment support, because again, the average Linux kernel gets about 7 years of support. Microsoft Windows gets 10. And that's for a long-term support version of Microsoft Windows. Microsoft is changing things up like Linux. And you have the challenge of what are the devices' life cycles, 15 to 20 years. When you start taking a look at that time frame, you still got Windows 2000 floating around in hospitals because of certain vendors that bring good things to life that have MRIs that run that. And also the cloud puts another wrinkle into this, which is configuration change support. So so a lot of these devices now connect to the cloud. What happens when a med device vendor decides, hey, my cloud-based architecture, I'm going to switch that over from AWS to Azure? What happens? How do I update devices so I don't have a couple million bricks sitting around in people's hospitals? How do I coordinate that? That's another wrinkle we really haven't thought of yet. And also the lack of incentives for manufacturers to monitor each step and build in these secure practices, because very bluntly, no one's really asked. And oftentimes we find ourselves in a position of having to be the first one that asks. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened over the past year. And the other example, we talked a lot about SolarWinds, but there was a secondary example that happened where somebody put some fake Python packages containing malware in Python repositories to see who would download them. And 33 major companies, including Apple, were on that list. So we have a big concern about open source and libraries that are used and getting that manifest. And also that the FDA guidance is more of a recommendation than a quote unquote force of law, plus also combined with the lack of uniformity. Again, bringing back to Julian's point about interoperability that we had to deal with. So the gaps we identified were 4 key gaps, which were, number one, people don't know what they have to do. And the example I give is that under the HIPAA security rule, if you're a covered entity, you introduce devices into your environment, your organization is responsible for assessing and addressing the risks that these devices pose in your environment. And yet, if I were to go to 80% of my peers and tell them that didn't work in large academic medical centers, what do you think the answer would be? The answer would be, I have to do that. I don't have the resources. Most hospitals and health systems don't have those resources for risk assessments or contract negotiations. They don't even know how to search for materials from the manufacturers or vendors. Not everyone is BD or Philips. And there's a lack of prescriptive guidance, AKA you can't identify a breach until it happens. So we went from there and talking about that. And Dave, do you want to cover the mitigation strategies and recommendations?
Sure. So again, our task was to look at supply chain for both software and hardware. And the concept of a software bill of materials has become popular. We talked a little bit about the National Telecommunications, NTIA, and NIST, the National Standards and Technology Group. They have come out with guidance. We need to look at things at the procurement stage. Mitch mentioned this form that is more widely used now, or hopefully will be more widely used, to find out what the manufacturers have done to address security. And then I think we also mentioned earlier that the need to, on a day-to-day basis, do better job in the operating phase. Alignment with international standards is going to be important. The FDA and the EU medical device regulations are good examples, getting those synchronized. And we came to realize that we have a very fragmented environment. We have different states. Certainly we have the FDA guidance and HIPAA, but then states and individual local jurisdictions and individual organizations do things differently. So we need some top-down goal-oriented leadership as an antidote to this fragmentation. And we talked a little bit about the success that West Virginia has had in their vaccine and opioids programs, where there was this kind of top-down leadership. Then in recommendations, we touched on a number of things. Certainly we need a plan with well-established and reasonable goals to address these problems in supply chain security. And we need to move from theory to implementation. How are we going to do that? We need to provide incentives to manufacturers. We had one person on the call from a manufacturing company, and really, manufacturers in a tough place. They have to compete, but what are the incentives for them to make sure that security is up to par? One way we can address the legacy equipment issue, we recommend that there be a combination of incentives to update the stuff where it can't be readily updated, to make sure compensating controls are in place, and ultimately setting some deadlines for end of life. We also talked a little bit about a more ubiquitous platform. This sort of relates to what was talked about a little earlier about interoperability. We even thought about interoperability as a service, that we may never come to one single standard for the communications, but if we have services that can do the translating, that would be helpful. And then we provided some links to some resources from the Health Sector Council, Coordinating Council, NIST, and a few other things.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anything else, Mitch and David? No?
Didn't really have anything else, but again, this is ever evolving, Florence. And again, also bring to the point of good data integrity. I want to make another point to Julian, and that is you can't have good data integrity unless you have a good supply chain and good data provenance across systems. And we all have to work together. And again, ultimately, if I can't verify that the data generated by a device has been accurately generated, then all bets are off for everything else, including the intelligent systems. And there's no way an intelligent system is going to compromise when you give it bad data. And that's a fatal assumption people are making.
Yeah. We use different types of Well, it was kind of early artificial intelligence, I guess, in the mainframe years ago. I used to be VP of marketing strategy for the mainframe. And if we could identify that there was a piece of the machine that just wasn't acting right, we would vary it offline, put it in its room and put it offline. We would quiesce it. I wonder if, there's some, type of tools like that we could apply. It's going to have to be smart, and it's going to have to be taught. There's a machine learning side of it too, I think, but there's a lot to consider here. Julian, you were going to say something, I think.
Yeah, I think unless something is a very sophisticated, cyber attack, if you're looking at it in a more plain way, then it's very important to have there's typically validation data. When making an observation or a measurement. So, if you check, for example, and that exists in so many ways, but just examples, blood pressure. If a blood pressure is markedly different in the current reading than it was 2 or 3 or 5 minutes ago, the first thing someone does is check it again. Yeah. Now, if the blood pressure is markedly different and there are other things to support that it should be different, let's say the patient's suddenly in pain and the pressure is high, then you don't rush to check it again thinking it's false because you now have other validating data. So, so unless something is really effective at intentionally manipulating the data, it's less likely to, to bypass kind of the current thoughtful data assurance approaches we have. And then even if we use something at the device level to prove that this data really came from that device, it still could be erroneous. I mean, again, I'm being just such a simple example, but a blood pressure cuff is handy. If it slips down from the arm to the forearm, which happens also, it will generate the wrong blood pressure. It'll still be the right device and it'll still be on the right patient, but it will no longer be applied correctly. And, there are analogs to this throughout all these discussions, of course, but I think there's this notion of the context or correlation and validation that we have to take into account. It's the reasonableness that we all use when we look at data. Like, does this really make sense? This can't be right. Let's check it. Could it really be, is it really 65 degrees outside today? Oh no, like someone changed the setting in my, weather app to Florida. We all do that. And so I think that's part of the challenge we have.
I agree.
I agree. And I think, again, I just want to make one final thing building on that, Julian. I've had discussions with a lot of people at Regenstrief about this, because when you build these systems, you're right about those assumptions. You have to be more explicit about what you do.
So,
very well said.
Part of trust, it's not just can you trust the source from a perspective as somebody intervened and messed with it, but what's the quality to begin with? Right.
Yeah, excellent. So, and I think your point, David and Mitch, is differentiating this. This is something we can do in a framework or a construct for that, to make it easier to access these concepts when looking at data.
Very well said. Great discussion, which is what we were really hoping for in the last 15 minutes, is let's all come together and see what we think. And we think there's a lot more to do, I guess I would say. And I think a lot of us could be part of the solution. A lot of you already are. So I think we want to go to next steps. Oh, and it looks like I'm the one doing that. So so what we're going to do is we have recorded this session and we've recorded the breakouts too. Some of them started a little bit late, but all of them were recorded. I bopped into all of them, and they'll be available for on-demand viewing, and they'll notify us from IEEE when they become available. We're going to be working, the students at Columbia and I are going to be working together on a documented summary of the breakout session. So thank you to all the students for taking notes and for all the facilitation and the great discussions. And we'll be coming out with that probably in a few weeks. It's midterm week here at Columbia. media. So then they have to decompress from that. And then I have my midterm site review with NSF at the beginning of March. So we have a lot going on here, but in a few weeks, we should have something for all of you. And we'll notify you via email once it's published. And then at the close, we'll post the link in the chat to complete the post-event evaluation survey. And we'd love to hear your feedback. We're planning to do this workshop series, the workshop every couple of months. The next one is on privacy, ethics, and trust in connected healthcare, and it's on the 28th of April, 2021. We were thinking of this time frame. We tried to choose it so it wasn't way too late in Europe, but I don't know if it's working in Asia. So when you do the feedback form, if you could tell us what you think, that would be great. And then we're going to be looking at, we were very lucky to have Julian as a keynote for this session, and to stay with us the entire time, Julian. It's been a great discussion. As we look at the next meeting on privacy, ethics, and trust, we are thinking about perhaps a panel, because as a number of the discussions showed in the breakouts, when you talk about privacy, ethics, and trust, it's different around the world. Our cultures are different. Our expectations are different. What we think is important is different. The policies are different. So we're thinking about maybe a little panel. So I already have a few people in mind, but we haven't invited any of them yet. We wanted to see, what output we got from this meeting. So if you have anyone in mind, then you can actually put that in the evaluation form, or you could send an email directly to one of us. I'll put my email in the chat. It's fh2417@columbia.edu, but I'll put it in the chat. And then we'll be, looking at that. And please invite your colleagues to register for the workshop series, and then they'll be able to view the on-demand and live broadcasts, because we're very grateful that this is free. And thank you, IEEE, for all this support. And thank you all the facilitators and Julian for the keynote, and the student facilitators. You all did a wonderful job. All the participants for sharing so openly your thoughts, ideas, and risks, challenges that you see. And for Christina and Christian at IEEE for guiding us through all of this. We really appreciate it.
Yes, and I echo Florence's sentiments. Thank you, everybody. Julian, the facilitators, and of course you all who attended and stayed through the end for your great contribution and questions and comments. This is what makes this event, even in a virtual platform, very, very exciting and inspiring. Just looking at the chat, I saw some are having some issues accessing the link to the evaluation form. What we'll do is we'll send a quick email to all the attendees, and basically just with the link, it's a Google form. So if hopefully you all can access Google platforms, but we'll send it via email. If not, another option might be just to cut and paste it and open your browser and directly into the browser outside of the platform, if you can do so. Apologies for the inconvenience on that. But again, we definitely appreciate if in one form or another you share your feedback with us. So with that, I think we have come to.
Wait.
Yep.
Wait. Yeah. Sorry. So I just looked at the URL when I pasted it into a browser, and it has an interesting URL. The very last word is form restricted. FORM restricted. So I don't know what that means. I'm not used to reading Google's URLs, but I can tell you I can't get it to work when pasting in another browser as well. So
I'll check with our marketing team. They're the one who developed it, the SA marketing team. So we'll just go back and tell them that we're having an issue and tell us to give us the cleaner version.
Security strikes again. There it goes. Usability versus security.
There you go. And so it's doing exactly what it was told to do, it sounds like.
Fascinating.
So we have to watch what we tell them to do. So, and Maria, thank you so much for your partnership as always. It's really been a great journey, and I'm so happy that it gets to continue.
Definitely. And we'll make these slides available for download, and there's an appendix showing the different standards projects that reflect some of the core concepts we talked about today, and obviously our industry connections programs, which are mostly what we like to call incubators for potential standards activities. But with that, I'd like to wish you all a great day. Enjoy your afternoon, evening, and we look forward to seeing you on April 28th for our next one. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.